The day Elias Crane buried his wife, he also buried every soft thing that had ever lived inside him, and for 6 long years the people of Dust Creek Territory had not once seen him smile. They talked about him the way people talk about weather that cannot be reasoned with. In the saloon on Madrona Street, old Roscoe Dillard would lean over his whiskey glass and say that Elias Crane had ice in his chest where a heart ought to be. The schoolteacher, a thin woman named Mrs. Polly Hatch, told her students to cross to the opposite side of the road if they ever saw Crane's black gelding tied outside a shop, because the man had a stare that could wilt a sunflower in July. The sheriff himself, a broad-shouldered man named Cal Whitmore, had once remarked privately to his deputy that doing business with Elias Crane was like negotiating with a granite wall. The wall was fair. Yes, the wall kept its word, but the wall would not look at you with anything resembling warmth. And yet the Crane Ranch itself was something to behold. Sitting at the foot of the Galloway Ridge in the New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1882, it spread across 400 acres of the finest grazing land in the region, flanked on the east by a clean river that never ran dry, and on the west by a stand of cottonwood trees so old and enormous that settlers heading into the territory used them as landmarks when they read their hand-drawn maps. The ranch house was solid, double-walled adobe with wide wooden beams and a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The stable held 18 horses. The bunkhouse held 8 hired hands, all of whom respected Elias Crane because he paid them honestly, worked beside them in the heat without complaint, and never asked a man to do something he would not do himself. They simply did not love him. They were not sure he wanted them to. His foreman, a leathery Mexican man named Domingo Reyes, had worked for Crane since the very first year the ranch was built. Domingo was 53 years old, had a gray mustache that curved slightly at the ends, and spoke English and Spanish with equal ease and equal bluntness. He was the only person on the property who spoke to Elias as though Elias were a human being rather than a force of nature. He was also, for 6 years, the only one who understood what had hollowed the man out. Her name had been Clara. She had died of fever in the winter of 1876 when she was 24 years old, and she had taken with her a child that never drew its first breath, and she had taken with her the version of Elias Crane that laughed at dinner and read aloud from books in the lamplight, and once, famously, danced with his hat on backwards at the Founders' Day celebration in Dust Creek, while Clara clapped her hands and cried with laughter. All of that had gone into the cold ground with her, and what remained was a man of formidable competence and absolute emotional desolation. He was 34 now. Tall, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, and eyes the color of old river stone, a gray that was neither blue nor brown but something of both. He was not unkind, exactly. He fed stray dogs. He once paid the doctor's bill for a Mexican family whose father had broken his leg falling from a wagon, asking Domingo to deliver the money anonymously so there would be no gratitude to accept. He kept his word in every transaction, commercial or personal, with a rigidity that bordered on the sacred. But he had not allowed anyone inside the particular room of himself where feeling lived, because he had bricked that room shut from the inside, and he had no intention of unsealing it. So when Domingo Reyes placed a folded letter on the kitchen table one Wednesday morning in April and said, without any preamble whatsoever, "I wrote to a matchmaking agency and sent." Louis, Elias set down his coffee cup with a precision that suggested he was choosing very carefully not to throw it. "You did what?" Elias said. It was not a question. It was the kind of sentence that arrives flat and final as a dropped stone. Domingo did not flinch. He had been waiting 6 years for this conversation. "I wrote to a matchmaking agency. The Halcott Agency, St. Louis, Missouri." Described the ranch, described your situation widower, no children, 400 acres, financially stable, and I described you in terms favorable enough that they would consider the application. Favorable terms, Elias repeated. I may have omitted certain aspects of your personality, Domingo said serenely. Which aspects? The ones that would have caused them to send the letter back unopened. Elias stared at his foreman. He stared for a long time. Outside, two of the ranch hands were already in the yard calling to each other about the south fence that had gone down in the night wind, and the morning light was coming in through the kitchen window at a long golden angle that made everything look softer than it was. I have no interest in a wife, Elias said. The ranch does, Domingo replied quietly. A house this size, this empty, it is not a home, Elias. It is a warehouse for a man. You are 34 years old. Clara has been gone 6 years. Am not saying forget her. Am saying that there is a difference between honoring a memory and building a prison from it. The silence that followed that speech was long enough to be uncomfortable. Elias picked up his coffee cup again. He stared at the letter on the table. He did not open it. I will read it, he said finally. I make no promises beyond that. He read it that evening alone by the lamp at his desk in the study. The agency's letter was formal and neatly typed, explaining that they had received his, that is, Domingo's inquiry and wished to put forward the candidacy of one Miss Nora Callahan, age 24, of Chicago, Illinois, currently residing with a cousin's family in Albuquerque following a recent relocation west. She was described as healthy, educated to a moderate degree, of good character, experienced in household management, and in possession of what the agency delicately termed a spirited disposition. Elias read the phrase spirited disposition and set the letter face down on the desk. He picked it up again. He read the rest. There was a small photograph included, a cabinet card that was slightly worn at the corners as though it had been handled many times before being enclosed. The woman in it was seated in a studio chair, wearing a dark dress with a white collar, her dark hair pinned up in the style of the day. She was not looking directly at the camera but slightly to the left, and there was something about her expression that struck him as insufficiently formal for a formal portrait, as though the photographer had said something in the moment before the shutter opened, and she had not quite gotten her face back to neutral. There was the ghost of something amused around her mouth. He put the photograph face down on top of the letter. He sat in the dark study for another hour. He wrote back. The letter he wrote was 5 sentences long. It confirmed the information Domingo had provided. It stated that he was prepared to offer a home of material stability and that he expected competent household management in return. It noted that he was a man of routine and preferred his household to run with consistency. It closed with his name. Domingo, who was asked to post the letter and read it first, said nothing when he returned from town. He simply set the posted receipt on the table and went back to work. But he stood for a moment in the doorway before he left, and he looked at Elias with the expression of a man who has planted a seed in extremely unyielding soil and is choosing to believe in the seed anyway. The reply came 3 weeks later. It was written in a hand that moved quickly across the page, the letters slightly uneven in a way that suggested the writer thought faster than she wrote. Miss Nora Callahan confirmed that she had been made aware of the arrangement and had agreed to it. She noted that she was not afraid of hard work. She wrote that she understood the nature of a marriage of practical arrangement and had no foolish expectations. She asked one question, direct and without apology. Was there a garden at the property, and if so, what was currently growing in it? Elias read that last line 3 times. He wrote back, "There is a garden. It is not currently in use. You may do with it as you see fit." She arrived on the 3rd Tuesday in May, on the afternoon stage from Albuquerque. Elias drove into Dusk Creek himself to meet it, which surprised several people who observed him pulling the wagon to a stop in front of the stage office. He sat in the wagon with his hat pulled low and his expression arranged in its customary stonework. And when the stage rolled in at 2:30 in a cloud of red dust, he climbed down and stood at the edge of the boardwalk with his arms at his sides like a man waiting for a business transaction to conclude. The first passenger out was a traveling salesman with 2 large cases and a sunburned neck. The second was an older woman with a carpet bag who was met immediately by a young boy who must have been her grandson. The third was Nora Callahan. She came out of the stage door and stepped down onto the boardwalk step, and then onto the street itself, with the particular sureness of a woman who had decided somewhere between Albuquerque and Dusk Creek that she was not going to be nervous, because being nervous would not help anything. She wore a blue traveling dress and a hat that had survived the journey with only minor damage, and she was carrying a small brown leather bag, and a larger trunk was being handed down from the stage roof behind her. She was of medium height, with dark hair and eyes that were brown with a quality of warmth in them that registered even at a distance, and when she looked at Elias Crane standing at the edge of the boardwalk with all the welcoming energy of a fence post, she looked at him for one clear moment, and this was the moment, though Elias did not understand it, yet she smiled. Not a polite smile. Not a performative, I am trying to make a good impression smile. Something quick and genuine, as though she had seen something that genuinely struck her as interesting, and her face had simply responded without permission. Elias did not smile back. He stepped forward and introduced himself in a tone that was not cold precisely, but was so stripped of warmth that it amounted to the same thing. "Miss Callahan, I'm Crane. I'll get your trunk." "Thank you," she said. Her voice was clear and direct. She did not seem disconcerted by his manner, which disconcerted him slightly in return. He loaded her trunk. She climbed up onto the wagon seat. He climbed up beside her. They drove out of Dusk Creek toward the Galloway Ridge in silence for approximately 4 minutes before she said, conversationally, "The desert is different than I expected. I thought it would be all sand, but it's more like rubble and purpose." "Rubble and purpose," Elias repeated. "Yes, like it has an opinion about itself." He said nothing. She looked out at the landscape with what appeared to be genuine interest rather than forced cheerfulness, and he drove, and the silence resumed. When they came around the bend in the road where the cottonwood stand first appeared, and then, beyond it, the white walls and brown roof of the ranch house catching the afternoon light, she made a small sound. Not dramatic, just a quiet, involuntary intake of breath. "It's beautiful," she said, not performing it, just saying it. He looked at his ranch the way a man looks at something he has stopped seeing because he has seen it every day for years. He did not reply. Domingo was on the porch when they arrived. He came down the steps with considerably more visible enthusiasm than his employer had demonstrated, took Nora's bag with a slight bow, introduced himself in both English and Spanish, and said, "We are very glad you have come," in a tone that made clear he was speaking for at least 2 people while only one of them was present. Elias showed her the house. He gave her the tour in the same manner he might have described a property to a potential buyer, factual, sequential, without embellishment. The kitchen, the main room, the dining room, the study which he noted was his private space. The second bedroom, which had been prepared for her with a clean quilt and a washstand and a small lamp. He told her the household ran on a schedule, and he intended it to continue doing so. He told her that meals were generally at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening. He told her that the hired hands ate in the bunkhouse and she was not responsible for their meals. She listened to all of this with her hands folded in front of her and her expression attentive. When he had finished, she said, "And where is the garden?" He took her around the side of the house. The garden was a rectangular space about 30 feet long, enclosed by a low adobe wall, and it was, as he had indicated, not currently in use. The soil was dry and hard, some old dried-out vines stumbling along one wall, the remnants of someone's ambition turned to dust and stick. She stood at the edge of it with her head tilted slightly to one side, looking at it the way someone looks at something that needs work but has good bones. "I can fix this," she said. "I expect you can," he said. They were married the following Saturday in the small church in Dusk Creek, with Domingo as witness and the pastor's wife as the second witness. And it was the kind of ceremony that was entirely without ceremony. Words were said, papers were signed. It was done. Elias did not look at her during the vows with anything other than the focused attention of a man ensuring the legal requirements were being correctly fulfilled. She said her vows clearly and without trembling. He said his the same way. Afterward, on the ride back to the ranch, she looked out at the western hills going orange and red in the late afternoon light, and she said, quietly and not unkindly, "You don't want this." He was quiet for a moment. "I made a commitment. That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed, "it is not." There was a pause. She said, still looking at the hills, "I don't need you to want it. I just need you to be honest with me. That matters more to me than wanting." He looked at her for a moment. Actually looked, not the brief observational glances he had been managing since her arrival. She was looking at the sunset and her profile was serious and calm, and there was something in her face that was entirely at peace with whatever the situation was, without any performance of peace, without trying to make him feel guilty or responsible. She had simply stated what she needed and offered him the same in return. "Then I will be honest with you," he said. "Good," she said, and they finished the drive in silence that was, for the first time, not entirely uncomfortable. The first 2 weeks were careful. They were two people occupying the same large house with the politeness of near strangers and the particular alertness of people who are each aware that the other person is present even when they cannot see them. Elias kept to his routines up before dawn, working the ranch through the heat of the day, back to the house in the evening, dinner at 6, the study afterward. He did not seek her company and did not avoid it. He was, as he had promised, honest. He answered questions when she asked them, fully and without deflection, and asked no more of her than she had agreed to provide. Nora, for her part, attacked the garden. Within 3 days of her arrival she had borrowed tools from the stable shed, turned the first row of dry soil, and sent a list to town with Domingo requesting specific seeds: tomato, squash, climbing beans, herbs. She was on her knees in the garden by 7 every morning, working with a focused, unhurried energy that one of the ranch hands, a young man named Pete Garland, described admiringly to the others as like watching someone who's figured out exactly what they're supposed to be doing and decided to just get on with it. Elias observed the garden's progress from a distance, which was to say he walked past it on his way to the stable each morning, and he could not avoid seeing it. The first seedlings appeared at the end of the first week. By the end of the second week, there was a distinct and visible organization to the beds, and she had resupported the old climbing vine along the south wall, and it was showing new green along its skeleton of old wood. He said nothing about the garden. She did not ask him to. The first conversation they had that was not transactional happened at the end of the second week, on a Thursday evening, when he came into the kitchen at 5 to find her reading at the kitchen table while a pot simmered on the stove. She had a book open, a thin, worn volume, and she was so absorbed in it that she did not hear him come in, which was unusual because his boots were not quiet. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment, observed her reading, and said, "What is that?" She looked up, entirely unstarted. "Emerson, the essays. The cousin I was staying with in Albuquerque had a library that would have shocked you with its ambition." She held the cover up. "Do you read?" "Yes." "What do you read?" He considered. "Practical things mostly. Land management, law, have some histories." "Do you enjoy the histories?" "Enjoyment is not precisely how I would describe the relationship," he said, with what might, in a different face, have been a very slight dry humor. She looked at him steadily and then said, "There is something in you that knows how to be funny." He looked back at her. "I would not go that far." "I would," she said pleasantly, and looked back at her book. He stood in the doorway for another moment, Then he came fully into the kitchen and poured himself a cup of water from the pitcher on the counter, and he did not leave as immediately as he might have, and the simmer of the pot was a comfortable sound in the room, and he found that he was not precisely eager to go to the study just yet. He stayed in the kitchen for 20 minutes. They did not talk the whole time, but they were in the same room without tension, which was new. The third week brought the incident with the horse. One of the mares, a bay called Sugarfoot who had always been temperate, got a burr under her saddle blanket and went sideways when young Pete Garland was leading her out of the stable, and in the resulting scramble Pete was thrown against the fence and came up holding his wrist at a wrong angle. Elias was across the yard in seconds, calm and efficient in the manner of a man who deals with emergencies by becoming more still rather than less. He assessed the wrist, told Pete he was fairly certain it was broken rather than dislocated, and started giving instructions about splinting. Nora was there within a minute of the noise. She had come from the garden and still had dirt on her knees, and she moved to Pete's other side and held him steady, while Elias bound the splint with a calm, practiced competence that reduced Pete from near panic to merely uncomfortable in about 3 minutes. She spoke to Pete in a low, steady voice the whole time, nothing dramatic, no false reassurances, just a warm and practical running commentary about what was happening and what would happen next that kept the young man anchored. When it was done and Pete had been helped to the bunkhouse to rest before someone drove him to the doctor in town, Elias straightened and found Nora already on her way to the water trough to wash the stable dust from her hands. He watched her for a moment. "You've done that before," he said. "Managed someone injured." "My father broke his arm when I was 16, she said, splashing water. 2 months before that my youngest brother cracked his head on the edge of the wood stove. My mother and I became efficient at emergency management out of necessity rather than design." "You were calm." She looked at him over her shoulder. "Panicking doesn't help the wrist." He regarded her. "No," he said. "It does not." She straightened, dried her hands on her apron, and went back to the garden without any further comment. He stood in the yard for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, looking at the gate to the garden through which she had disappeared. Domingo appeared at his shoulder with the timing of a man who had been watching carefully. He said nothing. Elias said, "Do not." "I did not say anything," Domingo said with enormous innocence. "You were about to." "I was going to ask if you wanted me to take Pete to the doctor," Domingo said, in a tone that made it completely unclear whether this was true. "Yes," Elias said. "Take him after dinner." Domingo went. Elias went back to work, but he did not entirely stop thinking about the way she had spoken to Pete, and the steadiness in her hands, and the fact that she had not waited to be asked before she came. What happened at the end of the 4th week was the laughter. It arrived without warning, the way all the significant things seem to arrive in the ordinary middle of an ordinary moment, with no particular ceremony to mark it as the moment that would rearrange everything. It was a Sunday morning in early June, clear and warm, and Elias was at the table in the kitchen eating breakfast before heading out to look at the north pasture fence. Nora had made biscuits that morning from scratch. She was a competent cook, more than competent, with a light hand for bread that the household had noted with appreciation. And she was at the counter when the ranch's dog, a considerable hound named Hector, who belonged more or less to everyone but slept nearest to the back door, got into the kitchen through the door she had left slightly open for the morning air. Hector was not a small dog. He was a large, affectionate, deeply undignified creature of no determinable breed, who expressed his emotions with his entire body at all times. He came into the kitchen at considerable speed because he had smelled the biscuits, and in his enthusiasm he put his front paws up on the counter directly beside where Nora was standing, which meant his enormous head was suddenly at her elbow, and he looked at the biscuits, and then he looked at her, and then he sneezed on her apron with a volume and completeness that was frankly impressive. There was a second of silence. And then Nora Callahan, The woman who had arrived at this ranch, composed and careful and navigating her new life with the measured dignity of someone who understood the stakes, laughed. It was not a polite laugh. It was not a controlled or considered laugh. It burst out of her full and unguarded and absolutely genuine, the kind of laugh that has no care for what it sounds like, high and warm and helpless. And she turned toward the dog and said, "Hector, you absolute menace," through her continuing laughter, and the dog wagged his entire rear end in response. And she was laughing so completely that she had to put one hand flat on the counter to steady herself. Elias, at the kitchen table with his coffee, went completely still. Not in the cold way. In the way that something very still happens in a person when they encounter something that bypasses all their defenses, because it did not arrive from the direction they were watching. The sound of her laugh moved through the kitchen and through the house, and through some sealed-off part of him that he had been certain for 6 years was no longer accessible. And something in there, something that had been sitting in the dark for a very long time, turned toward it, the way a plant turns toward light, involuntarily, entirely without his permission. She got control of herself, turned, and found him staring at her. She was still bright from the laughing, her cheeks flushed, her eyes lit up in a way that was entirely different from how she had looked for all the weeks preceding this moment. And for a second, her expression was just open and unguarded and wholly herself. Then she seemed to register his expression, not cold, but stunned in a way he was clearly not accustomed to being stunned, and something in her face became aware that something had happened. "Sorry," she said, not embarrassed, just acknowledging. "Hector is very enthusiastic." "Yes," Elias said. His voice was slightly different from his customary voice, not dramatically, just slightly. She looked at him for one more moment, tilted her head the smallest degree, and then turned back to her biscuits. Hector was escorted back outside. Breakfast continued, but the room was different after that. Some particular quality of the air had shifted in a way that could not be shifted back, and Elias sat with his coffee for longer than usual, not looking at anything in particular, aware of something he could not yet name trying to resurface from a very great depth. He went out to the north pasture. He worked. He worked very hard, with the focused physicality of a man using his body to outrun something he is not ready to think about yet. By noon he was at the fence line half a mile from the house, and he could not have told you what was in his own thoughts because he was not looking at them yet. But he was aware that something had shifted in the machinery of himself. Some gear had engaged that had been still for years, and the shift was uncomfortable the way blood returning to a numb limb is uncomfortable, not bad, but alarming in its insistence on being felt. Domingo brought him lunch at the fence line, as he sometimes did. He set the wrapped food on the fence post and said nothing for a moment, and then he said, "I heard she has a laugh that carries." Elias looked at him. "Were you in the kitchen?" "I was passing the window," Domingo said, entirely without guilt. "Then you were near the window deliberately." Domingo considered this. "Hector may have gone inside. I may have been concerned about the biscuits." Elias said nothing. He unwrapped the food. He ate. After a while he said, without looking up, "She is not who I expected." Domingo said nothing because this was one of those situations where silence is the correct tool. "She does not," Elias paused. "She does not try to change the temperature of a room. She simply is herself in it, and the temperature changes on its own." "Yes," Domingo said quietly. "That is usually how it works." Elias looked at the fence line. "I'm not ready," he said, and the words were simple and direct, and they cost him something to say. "No one is ever ready," Domingo said, in the tone of someone who has been watching human beings make this particular mistake for 53 years. "That is not how it arrives." Elias finished his lunch and went back to the fence. The days after that were different in a way that was subtle, and then increasingly less subtle. Elias found himself paying attention in a way he had not permitted himself before. He noticed that she hummed when she was doing something she found satisfying, not a song with a name, just a low, continuous melody of occupation. He noticed that she read before sleeping, and that the lamp in her room was sometimes on until quite late, visible as a thin gold line under the door. He noticed that she had a way with the garden that was personal. She talked to the plants sometimes, not loudly, just small practical observations. "You are doing better than I expected," or "I think you need more water than I've been giving you," in the same direct and honest tone she used with everyone else, and it occurred to him that she apparently treated plants with the same respect she offered people. He noticed that she had made friends with Pete Garland's mother, who lived in town, and had begun making the trip to Dusk Creek on Wednesday mornings to visit, and that she came back from these visits in a particular mood of refreshed and easy happiness that lasted the rest of the day. He noticed that she did not ask anything of him that was not in the scope of what they had agreed, but that she also never treated their arrangement as lesser than what it was. She was fully present in the house, fully engaged in its running, and she did it without any trace of martyrdom or performance. He came home one Wednesday evening from a late trip to check on some cattle, and found the kitchen empty, but a covered plate on the table for him and the stove still warm. He stood in the kitchen alone and looked at the covered plate for a moment. He lifted the cover. She had left him roast beef and potatoes, and a small jar of the tomato preserve she had made from the first tomatoes in the garden, which had come in red and heavy the week before. There was a note underneath the plate. "The front step is loose on the left side. I nearly went through it this morning." He ate his dinner. He fixed the step by lamplight before he went to bed. In the morning she came out of her room and saw the repaired step and looked up at him across the yard and said, "Thank you, just that, plain and complete. Watch the right side as well," he said. "It'll go next." "I will," she said, and went to her garden. He stood on the porch for another minute. The morning was pink and gold, and the cottonwoods down the way were moving slightly in the early breeze, and the garden was showing its full June green, and the ranch smelled of warm earth and horses and wood smoke from the kitchen, and something in him ached with a quality he had not felt in 6 years, not grief, not pain, but the specific ache of a person who has been alone a long time, suddenly becoming aware of what not being alone might feel like. He went to the stable. He worked. He kept going. The conversation that changed the next thing happened in the garden at dusk at the end of the second week of June. He had stopped to look at the climbing beans along the south wall because they were up to his shoulder now and doing something remarkable. She was there, at the far end of the bed, tying the new growth to the supports with strips of soft cloth. "These are doing well," he said. It was not a question. She looked down the length of the beans at him. "They are. The soil here is better than it looks. Once you get below the first inch of crust, it's actually quite good." He walked the length of the bed slowly, looking at the growth. "My wife planted a garden," he said, and he did not know entirely why he said it, and his voice was even. "In the first year. She did not have the patience this requires. She wanted everything immediately." It was the first time in 6 years he had said the word wife with a live meaning rather than a technical one. The first time he had offered the information voluntarily rather than in the context of a legal or business document. Nora did not stop what she was doing. She continued tying the next stem to its support and said, "What was she like?" And the thing was the extraordinary thing, the thing that undid the last careful construction around him, was that the question was asked with complete sincerity. No careful handling, no delicate dance around the subject, no fearful silence. Just a real question asked honestly by someone who genuinely wanted to know. He was quiet for long enough that she looked up, checking whether she had overstepped. "She was bright," he said. "Everything she did at high speed and high volume. She filled every room she entered. She was not calm in the way that you are calm." He paused. "She laughed a great deal." Nora was watching him now, her hand still on the bean vine. "I'm sorry," she said, and then, "Not sorry as a formality. I'm genuinely sorry that someone who made rooms bright was taken from a person who loved her." His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the way it does when something real touches something tender. "It was a long time ago," he said. "Grief does not care how long ago," she said simply. They were quiet for a moment. The sun was nearly at the ridge, and the garden was going gold and deep green in the last light, and somewhere out past the stable one of the horses was making the comfortable low sound horses make at the end of a day. "You have not asked anything of me," he said, and this came out differently than he intended, more open than he meant, with a quality of observation that was edged with something that might have been wonder. "In the 6 weeks you have been here, you have not asked me to be different from what I am." She considered this. "No," she said, "I haven't." "Why not?" She set down her cloth ties and straightened up and looked at him directly. "Because I don't think you are who you're performing to be," she said. "Think you are someone who was hurt very badly and decided the safest response was to stop being available to hurt. And I think that is a completely understandable decision. Just don't think it's who you actually are." The last of the sun came over the ridge and the garden went quiet and purple-shadowed. And Elias Crane stood in the garden his new wife had brought back to life, and felt something in him strain against its moorings in a way that was frightening and necessary at the same time. "You are remarkably direct," he said, and his voice was not quite steady. "My father said I came out of the womb with opinions," she said, and there was warmth in it without any self-consciousness, and then she picked up her tools and said, "Dinner in an hour," and walked past him toward the house, and he stood in the garden in the last of the light for a long time. That night he sat in his study and he did not read. He sat at his desk with the lamp burning, and he looked at the wall where the only personal thing in the room was a small framed photograph of Clara, taken the year of their marriage, and he looked at it for a long time. He was not a man who cried. He had not cried since the winter of 1876, but he sat with the photograph and he spoke to it, which he had not done in years, and he said quietly, "I did not plan this." And then, after a long pause, "I do not know what to do with it." And the room held the words, and the lamp burned, and outside through the window the New Mexico sky was enormous and full of stars. And slowly, over a long and careful silence, something in him unclenched for the first time in 6 years. He woke the next morning earlier than usual, and went to the kitchen and made coffee himself, which he did not normally do because Nora was usually there first. She came in 20 minutes later and found him at the stove and stopped in the doorway. "You made coffee," she said. "There is enough for 2 cups," he said. She came in, he poured them both. They sat at the kitchen table and the morning was still pale outside the windows, and there was something comfortable and new about the silence between them, a different quality of it, a quiet that was full rather than empty. He said after a while, "My name is Elias. You have not used my name once in 6 weeks." She looked at him over her cup. "I was waiting for permission," she said. "Not formally, just waiting for it to feel right to you." "It feels right," he said. "Elias," she said, testing it, and something about hearing his own name in her voice, spoken with that easy warmth, did something that rearranged the furniture of his interior landscape in a way that was not reversible. "Nora," he said back, and she smiled at him across the table, not the polite smile and not the social smile, but the real one, the one from the photograph, the one that had been waiting under the surface since the first day. He did not smile back, not quite. But he almost did, and she saw the almost, and it was enough. The summer deepened. The garden became extraordinary. She had a gift for it that went beyond competence into genuine artistry, the layout, the companion planting she had read about in some book she had sent away for, the way she managed the water from the eastern rain runoff, and by July the garden was producing more than the 2 of them could eat alone. She began bringing vegetables into Dust Creek on her Wednesday trips, giving them to the doctor's office, to families she knew were stretching their provisions thin. There were 4 Mexican families who lived on the edge of town in conditions that were difficult, families that the town's main commerce largely ignored, and she brought them what she had without making a show of it, and without the particular condescending quality that charitable giving sometimes takes on when it is performed rather than felt. Elias found out about this from Domingo, who found out from a man in town who had seen her. He said nothing to Nora about it, but he added a line item to his monthly town account at the dry goods store and told the owner that Mrs. Crane had a running account there, and he should fill whatever she asked for without waiting for cash. Nora came home from town 2 Wednesdays later with a look of slight puzzlement and said, "The store owner told me I had an account." "Yes," he said. "That was you." "Yes," she looked at him steadily. "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said. She held his gaze, and then she said simply, "Thank you, Elias." And she went to her garden, and he stood in the doorway of the house watching her go and understanding in a way that was now unavoidable that he was in love with his wife. It arrived not like a wave, not like a dramatic revelation, but like something that had been true for weeks and had finally allowed itself to be seen. He loved the way she moved through the world without apology and without performance. He loved that she had looked at him, this closed, cold, deliberately distanced man, and had chosen to see through it rather than accept it as his whole. He loved her directness and her humor and her stubborn, tireless care for things, for plants, for a boy with a broken wrist, for families at the edge of town that the world was not particularly looking after. He did not yet know how to say any of this. He was a man who had spent 6 years unlearning how to be open, and relearning was not instantaneous. But he began, in his careful and methodical way, to try. He started by being present. He had been technically present since her arrival, but now he made the choice to be actually present, to be in the room not because he had business there, but because she was there. He began asking her about her days in a way that was not merely polite but actually interested. He asked about the families she visited in town. He asked about what she was reading. She was working through a volume of astronomy. Domingo had found it in a box of books left by a previous guest, and she had commandeered it with delight, and one evening she came to the dinner table with it and began explaining, with infectious enthusiasm, something about the movement of stars that she had read that afternoon, and he listened with his full attention and asked questions, and the dinner went an hour longer than usual and neither of them noticed. He showed her the land. This was the truest gift he knew how to give, and he gave it with care. He took her on rides through the property on calm Sunday mornings, not the working rides he did during the week but exploratory ones, the kind Clara had always asked for, and he had never quite had the patience for, and which he found himself conducting now with something that was genuinely enjoyment. He showed her where the river ran clean and cold over white stones. He showed her the place on the East Ridge where, at the right time of morning, the light came through the cottonwoods at an angle that turned everything amber and gold. He showed her the spot where a family of roadrunners had made their home in a cactus stand, and where, if you were quiet enough, you could watch them moving through the brush with their peculiar purposeful efficiency. She was a good rider. He had not expected that, though he was not sure why she had not seemed fragile, but there was something about her that was so deeply domestic in its happiness that he had perhaps assumed she was more at home in kitchens than saddles. She sat a horse with confidence, and she could pick up a canter without being told how to adjust, and she clearly loved it, the movement and the space and the scale of the country opening out around her. "You ride well," he told her one morning in August when they were coming back from the river. "My uncle had horses in Illinois," she said. "I rode every summer as a child. I missed it terribly in Chicago. There was not a great deal of use for it there." "Why did you go to Chicago?" She was quiet for a moment, the horses walking easy side by side. "My father died when I was 19. My mother and the boys went to live with her sister. I needed work, and Chicago had more of it than our town did." She paused. "I worked in a household there for 4 years. It was fine. It was not where I was supposed to be, but did not know where that was yet. And Albuquerque." My cousin Margaret had married a man who moved west. She wrote and asked me to come. I did. A slight pause, and then the agency. And then the agency, he repeated. I want you to know, she said, carefully looking between her horse's ears, that I did not come here because I had no other options. I had options. Chose this. He looked at her. She was still looking ahead. Why did you choose this? He asked, and it was a real question with something underneath it that was both vulnerable and important. She considered for a long moment. The letter, she said finally, your letter to the agency. My letter was 5 sentences long and offered nothing beyond material stability, he said. Yes, she said, and every one of those 5 sentences was honest. In a different letter, in a different man's letter, there would have been charm and reassurance and promises. Yours had none of that. It was exactly what it was. She looked at him now. I thought here is a man who tells the truth even when the truth is not flattering. That seemed worth meeting. He held her gaze from the back of his horse in the August morning, and something in his face moved in a way that it did not generally move. You are an unusual person, he said. You say that like an observation, she said, but your voice does a thing when you say it. What thing? She considered. Like you mean it as a compliment, but you are not accustomed to giving compliments, so it comes out sideways. He stared at her, and then quietly, briefly, barely there and then gone again, but absolutely real, the corner of his mouth moved upward. She did not say anything about it. She looked back at the trail ahead of them, but she was smiling herself, and she was not hiding it. That half-smile on his face was witnessed later that day by Pete Garland, whose wrist had healed cleanly and who was back to full work, and who reported to the bunkhouse that evening that he had seen the boss smile. This intelligence caused a significant amount of discussion, some skepticism, and one bet between 2 of the hands about whether it would happen again. Domingo, hearing the discussion secondhand, went to his bunk and lay down with his hands behind his head and looked at the ceiling and felt a satisfaction so deep it was almost physical. September came in golden and dry and good. The garden was at its height, heavy with the last of summer's production, and Nora was preserving things, jars of tomato, jars of beans, dried herbs hanging from the kitchen ceiling in small fragrant bundles, a jar of something she called garden pickle that she had learned from the cook in the Chicago household, in which, it turned out, was deeply good on everything. The Friday evening of the 2nd week of September, there was a harvest social in Dusk Creek. It was an annual event, held in the livery barn, with fiddle music and dancing, and it was the nearest thing the town had to a communal celebration. Elias had not attended in 5 years. He had sent Domingo in his place with the ranch's annual donation to the town fund, which ensured his absence was not commented upon as rudely as it might otherwise have been. Nora mentioned the social on the Thursday before, casually, in the way of someone noting the existence of a thing without making a request. He said nothing. She said nothing further. On Friday afternoon, he came in from the east pasture at 3, which was 2 hours earlier than usual, and he washed at the pump in the yard with more attention than was strictly necessary for a man planning an ordinary Friday evening. And when he came into the kitchen, Nora was at the counter in her everyday dress, and he said, "If you would like to go to the social this evening, I would take you." She went still for a moment. Then she turned, and her face had the open quality it got when something genuinely pleased her. "I would like that," she said. They arrived at the livery barn when the dancing was already underway, the fiddle and the second fiddle going at a reel, and the floor half full of couples and single dancers and children. The effect of Elias Crane walking into the Dusk Creek harvest social was considerable. Conversations paused. Sheriff Whitmore, who was standing near the door with a cup of cider, looked at Elias with an expression of visible amazement that he was only partially successful in concealing. Old Roscoe Dillard, at his usual station near any available beverage, put his cup down and blinked. Elias was aware of the attention. He ignored it with the practiced ease of a man who has been talked about for years. He brought Nora to the edge of the floor, and she immediately found Pete Garland's mother, a comfortable woman named Ada Garland, and the two of them fell into cheerful conversation. Elias stood beside them and accepted the social pleasantries that came his way with more warmth than his reputation led anyone to expect, and if he was not exactly expansive, he was at least present, which was more than 6 years had offered. When the music shifted into a slower song, he turned to Nora and said, with the formality of a man making a decision he has considered carefully, "I am not a capable dancer. I used to be passable, and I am probably no longer that. But if you would like to dance, I will not disgrace either of us entirely." She looked at him bright-eyed. "That is the most qualified invitation to dance I have ever received." "I believe in accurate representations," he said, and she laughed that full, unguarded laugh, right there in the middle of the crowded barn, and he held out his hand and she took it. He was not as bad as he had warned. He was methodical about it, which meant he kept time correctly and maintained appropriate space and did not step on her feet, which is more than many partners manage. But it was the closeness that mattered, not the technique, the fact of his hand at her waist, which was the first time he had touched her with anything other than incidental courtesy, and the fact that she was looking up at him with her whole face present and open, and he was looking down at her in a way he was no longer trying to manage or conceal. They danced 2 songs. The barn around them went on with its noise and its warmth and its motion, and in the middle of it all they were their own quiet country. Walking back to the wagon after, with the night air cool and full of stars and the music fading behind them, she tucked her hand through his arm. It was natural and undemanding, as natural as everything she did, and he looked down at her hand on his arm and did not remove it. He settled it slightly more securely, which was a more significant gesture than it might appear. They drove home. The stars were extraordinary over the desert. The sky in New Mexico territory in September 1882 had no competition from any artificial light, and it was a spectacle that never became ordinary. They drove in comfortable quiet, and at one point she tipped her head back to look at the sky and said, "Oh," softly to herself, and he looked where she was looking and saw the particular density of stars that filled the ridge line. "The astronomy book," he said. "Yes," she said, "I know where some of them are now. That one," she pointed, "is part of what the book calls the summer triangle, though it says it's visible into autumn. And there, another direction, is Saturn. You can tell because it does not flicker the way the other lights do." He looked at where she pointed. He could not tell Saturn from a regular star, but he believed her. "How did you learn this so quickly?" he said. "I wanted to know," she said simply. "Things I want to know I learn fast. Things I don't want to know can wait indefinitely." She paused. "My mother used to say I was highly selective about what I gave my attention to." "What do you give your attention to?" he asked, and it was a direct and genuine question. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Things that are real, things that grow, things that are honest." A pause. "People who are trying." He kept his eyes on the road. He was quiet for long enough that she looked at him. His profile in the starlight was what it always was, strong and angular and closed, except that it was somewhat less closed than it used to be, and had been consistently less closed for weeks now, and she had been watching the gradual opening of it with a particular quality of attention that she was beginning to recognize as not merely observation but feeling. "Nora," he said, and stopped. "Yes," she said, waiting. "I want to tell you something and am not certain of the words." "That's fine," she said. "You can start with the approximate version." He was quiet another moment. The horse kept its steady pace. The stars continued their unconcerned burning overhead. "I am aware that this arrangement began as something practical," he said. "I am aware that I came into it with deficiencies, of openness, of warmth, things that a person entering a marriage has a right to expect and that I did not offer." He paused. I want to say that whatever this has become, for me, it is no longer an arrangement. It is, I would like it to be more than that if you are willing, And if this has been Elias, she said gently. Yes. Fell in love with you sometime in June, she said in the direct, unhurried way she said everything. Have been waiting for you to catch up. He turned to look at her. She was looking back at him, entirely steady and entirely open, and there was no performance in her face and no calculation, only the clean fact of what she had said. He stopped the wagon. He sat for a moment, and then he turned toward her on the seat, and he raised his hand and touched her face, his thumb along her cheekbone, careful and deliberate, as though he were making an inventory of something very important, and she did not move except to lean the smallest degree into his hand. And he said, I have been in love with you since a Sunday morning when a dog sneezed on your apron. She made a sound that was caught between a laugh and something more tender, and then he kissed her careful at first, the way he did most things, and then less careful, and then not careful at all, and the desert night held them in its enormous, indifferent, beautiful silence, and somewhere in the cottonwoods stand a night bird called once and was still. The ride home after that was different from every ride preceding it. October arrived, and the ranch moved into its autumn rhythms, the cattle being brought closer in, the firewood being cut and stacked, the garden put to rest for the winter with Nora's characteristic thoroughness, the beds turned, and the soil rested and certain things left in the ground to winter over and return. She was philosophical about the end of the growing season, but it was clear she was already planning the spring. She had been, by this time, in complete and unambiguous possession of his heart, and he was slowly, imperfectly, with the particular effort of a man dismantling something he has built with great care over years, learning to be a husband in the full sense of the word. Not just present but giving, not just honest but tender. He was not transformed suddenly into a different person. He was still quiet, still methodical, still the kind of man who expressed himself through action more than words. But the actions had changed. He came to find her in the evenings rather than retreating to the study. He fixed every loose board and worn hinge in the house with a particular dedication that she interpreted correctly as an expression of care in the language he was most fluent in. He built her a proper potting shelf on the south wall of the stable for starting seedlings in the late winter, which she discovered one morning and stood before with her hands clasped and a brightness in her face that he watched and felt land somewhere deep in his chest. He began to laugh, not often, not loudly, but genuinely, and for the first time since the winter of 1876, the sound of his own laugh did not feel foreign to him. It happened first properly on an October evening, when Domingo came to dinner, which was itself a new development, Nora having instituted Thursday dinner at the main house as a regular arrangement, in recognition of the fact that Domingo was the closest thing to family Elias had, and Domingo, who had been known to have a gift for storytelling when in good company, began telling a story about a horse he had once worked with in Sonora, who had developed a particular prejudice against one specific color of hat. He told it well. He had the timing right and the details right, and the way Nora was laughing beside Elias at the table, fully and freely, and the way Domingo was building to the final detail of the story with the deliberate care of someone who knows where the joke lies, and then the final detail arrived, and Elias Crane laughed. A real laugh. A laugh that came from somewhere genuine and rang in the room like something returning from a long absence, warm and unfamiliar and absolutely real. Domingo stopped talking. He looked at Elias. Elias was still coming down from the laugh, slightly surprised by his own reaction, and then he looked at Domingo and said, "Go on. What happened with the hat?" Domingo finished the story, with perhaps slightly less precision than usual, because he was occupied with a profound and private emotion that was moving through his chest in the manner of very great relief. After dinner, when Nora had gone inside and Domingo and Elias were standing on the porch in the cool October night, Domingo said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "The ranch sounds different." Elias was quiet. Then he said, "Yes, I know. It sounds like a home," Domingo said simply. Elias looked out at the yard, the stable, the long line of the cottonwoods against the dark sky. "Yes," he said again, and his voice was quiet and certain and at peace. The winter of 1882 settled over the Galloway Ridge with a particular beauty and severity that the New Mexico Territory saved for its cold season's clear air of extraordinary purity. Nights of severe cold, days of brilliant sunlight that made every shadow on the snow-patched ground sharp as cut paper. The ranch house, double-walled and well-stocked from the productive year, was warm and close in the winter evenings, and the life inside it had a quality of intimacy and completeness that Elias had not known for so long that he had forgotten it was a thing that was possible. They read together in the evenings, sometimes aloud to each other. She introduced him to the Emerson, which he approached skeptically and engaged with more seriously than he admitted. He brought out the histories and read her sections that he had underlined years ago, and she asked questions about them that made him think about things he thought he had already understood. She received a letter from her mother in November. She read it at the kitchen table, and when she looked up there was a particular quality of warmth and distance in her face that he recognized as nostalgia. "My brother Robert has just started school," she said. "He is 7 now." She paused. "I miss them." "They could visit," he said, and he said it without the slight hesitation that would have been there 3 months before. She looked at him. "In the summer, perhaps." "If the accommodations—" "There are accommodations," he said. "Write and tell them they are welcome." She wrote to her mother that evening, and the quality of her face for the rest of the night had a happiness in it that was specific and full, and that he watched with a satisfaction he no longer tried to conceal from himself. December brought with it a snowfall that kept the household close for 3 days. The ranch hands managed the animals, but the main house was a world unto itself, and those 3 days had a particular quality of warmth and closeness and ease. He played cards with her in the afternoon, at the kitchen table, and she was an excellent card player who had clearly played with siblings and had not an ounce of false modesty about her ability, and she beat him twice and looked insufficiently apologetic about it. "You cheated," he said. "I played correctly and well," she said, gathering the cards. "You counted, paid attention," she said pleasantly. "Those are different things." He watched her shuffling and felt the warm, familiar ache of loving someone, and he said, "Nora." She looked up. "I want you to know," he said, choosing his words with care, "that I understand what you gave up, coming here, entering an arrangement with a man who was, by any fair assessment, a significant risk." She set the cards down and folded her hands on the table and gave him her full attention, which was always, when she offered it, a considerable thing. "I want you to know that I am aware that it has not always been easy, that I was not easy, that there were weeks at the beginning when you were generous to me in a way that you had no obligation to be, and I gave you very little in return." He paused. "Am not that man anymore, or am trying not to be, and I want you to know that I see what you gave and am grateful for it every day." She looked at him across the table for a long moment. Her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the full and open quality they got when something moved her. "Elias," she said, "you gave something back too. You may not have realized it, but you did." "What did it give you?" "Honesty," she said. "Reliability. A home where things are exactly what they appear to be, where no one performs a feeling they do not have. Was surrounded for years by people who said what they thought others wanted to hear, and I was so tired of it." She paused. "You are precisely what you are. Even when what you are was closed and cold and difficult, it was real. And I can work with real, cannot work with performance." He reached across the table and took her hand, and she turned her hand in his and held it, and outside the snow continued and the house was warm, and they sat that way for a while without needing to fill it with anything else. By Christmas, which they celebrated quietly with Domingo and with old Pete Garland, who had nowhere to be, there was a quality to the ranch house that anyone entering it would have recognized immediately as happiness. The kitchen smelled of evergreen branches, and something spiced that Nora had devised from dried fruit and winter herbs. The table was full. Domingo told more stories. Pete Garland, who was not much of a conversationalist under normal circumstances, contributed two surprisingly good jokes, and a story about a Christmas in his childhood that went sideways in the most entertaining possible direction. Nora laughed until she had to put her cup down. Elias sat at the head of the table and watched the people around it with the specific expression of a man who has not allowed himself to have things he loves, and is now in the process of having them, and is still slightly astonished by his own fortune. After dinner, when Domingo and Pete had gone and the house was quiet, he gave her a gift. He had ordered it in October through the dry goods store, a new edition of a botanical reference book, a proper one, the kind a serious gardener needs, with detailed illustrations and planting guidance arranged by region and climate. It had taken 8 weeks to arrive. He handed it to her, and she looked at the cover, and then looked at him with an expression of such genuine delight that he felt it in his chest like the first warm day after a very long winter. "How did you know they had published this?" she said. "You mentioned a botanical reference when you were writing your planting notes in September," he said. "You said you wished you had a proper one. You remembered that." "I remember most things you say," he said. She looked at him. She set the book down on the table. She walked directly to him and put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him with a warmth and completeness that suggested she had been thinking about how to thank him for several seconds and had decided this was the most accurate expression. January and February were the deep months, cold and brilliant and still. Nora began planning the spring garden from her new book, filling the kitchen table with notes and diagrams on evenings when the cold kept everything indoors. Elias would come and look at what she was planning and ask questions, and she would explain. And gradually he found himself genuinely invested in the spring planting in a way he had not anticipated. She talked him into building a proper cold frame along the south-facing stable wall, a glass-topped box for starting seedlings early, and he built it over 3 February weekends with the focused satisfaction of a man making something he knows will be used and valued. He wrote to his solicitor in Santa Fe in February regarding a legal matter. When it was done, he told Nora at dinner one evening that he had updated his will and his property documentation to reflect their marriage properly and completely, including provisions he felt she should know about. She listened to the details with the serious attention she gave to everything that mattered, and at the end she said, "You did not have to tell me all of this." "I did," he said. "You are my wife. You have a right to know what you are a part of." She nodded. And then she reached across the table and briefly touched the back of his hand, a small, complete gesture, and said, "Thank you, Elias," and meant it with the full weight of what it signified. March arrived like a return. The garden came back under Nora's hands with a thoroughness that suggested it had been waiting all winter for her attention, which perhaps it had. The cold frame was full of seedlings by mid-March, and she walked it every morning with the satisfaction of someone tending something she has created from nothing, counting new growth with a quiet delight that Elias had come to love watching. He walked with her sometimes. He had developed the habit of accompanying her to the garden in the early morning. Not to work in it, it was her kingdom, and she managed it with a capable authority that left no room for interference, but simply to be there. The two of them in the cool morning with the ranch waking up around them and the cottonwoods beginning their first new green. "You are happy," she said to him one March morning, with the directness that was still the most characteristic thing about her. "Yes," he said without pause. And it was true in a way that was no longer surprising. It had simply become the condition of his life. The way cold had been the condition before, and the transition between the two was something he was still not entirely able to account for, except that he knew when it had started, and he knew exactly who was responsible. She looked at him with the warm, specific look that was only for him and said, "Good." And then she turned back to the cold frame, and he stood in the March morning and understood that he was in possession of everything he needed, and that he was, at last, not simply surviving in the shell of a life but living inside it. The spring of 1883 brought Nora's mother and her brother Robert for a 3-week visit, the first of what would become an annual arrangement. Her mother was a small, energetic woman named Margaret. Nora's grandmother had also been a Margaret, which explained the cousin in Albuquerque, and she arrived with Robert, who was 7 and immediately fell in devoted worship of Domingo, who taught him to throw a rope with enormous patience and no small amount of humor. Nora's mother walked through the house and the garden on the first evening and said to Elias, with a frank directness that made it entirely clear where Nora had gotten it from, "My daughter is well. Thank you for that." Elias said, "She is responsible for most of it, Mrs. Callahan looked at him for a long moment and then smiled. "You are not entirely what I was told to expect," she said. "I have been told that before," he said. She laughed, not as fully as Nora, but with the same quality of genuine amusement, and said, "No, I mean that as a high compliment," and went into the kitchen to find her daughter. The 3 weeks were a full and lively expansion of the household's usual pace, with young Robert providing a degree of animated noise and enthusiasm that the bunkhouse found enormously entertaining, and which Elias, who had expected to find it exhausting, discovered he did not find exhausting at all. He played a game of checkers with the boy on the second Saturday, and lost deliberately at first, and then genuinely, because the boy had a tactical intelligence that was both ridiculous for his age and deeply recognizable as a Callahan family trait. The night before Nora's mother and Robert left, after Robert was in bed, Nora and Elias sat on the porch in the late spring night, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they sat that way with the sound of the crickets beginning in the grass and the stars overhead in their familiar arrangements. "When you were with Robert today," she said, "you were good with him. He was quiet a moment. He is a good boy." She tilted her head up to look at him. There was something in her face that was both tender and tentative. "I would like," she started and stopped. "Yes," he said quietly, knowing. She looked at him. "You knew what I was going to say." "I have been thinking it as well," he said. His voice was steady and certain. "For a while now." She looked at him for a long moment with her whole face open. "Are you ready for that?" He thought about it honestly, because he was still at his foundation an honest man. He thought about the years of cold and the years of grief, and the way this woman had walked into his closed-up house and laughed at a dog and grown things in barren soil, and waited for him to find his way back to himself. He thought about the breakfast on the morning when he made the coffee, and the evening in the garden when he first said Clara's name aloud, and the night on the road home from the social when he stopped the wagon under the stars. He thought about all the small, careful steps of the past year leading to this porch this night, her head on his shoulder. "Yes," he said, "I am." And in the early months of 1884, on a morning in February, when the light was coming in long and golden through the kitchen window, Nora told him at the breakfast table that she was expecting a child. He set down his coffee cup with great care and looked at her across the table with an expression that she had not seen before on his face, an expression of something so complete and unguarded that it was almost unfamiliar on the features she had come to know so well. Not a man carefully managing what he revealed, just a man feeling something enormous. He stood up from the table and came around to her side and took her hands in both of his, and she looked up at him, and his face was doing the thing it still sometimes did when feeling was bigger than habit, slightly unsteady, slightly undone by itself. "Are you well?" he said, which was the first thing because he was still the man he was. "Very well," she said, squeezing his hands. "Completely well." He stood holding her hands, and then he crouched down beside her chair so they were level, and he looked at her face for a long moment, and then he said, very quietly, "Thank you." She knew he did not mean only the child. He meant all of it, the year and the garden, and the laughing and the returning and the entirety of what she had brought back to this house. And to him, by simply being herself in it, without apology or performance. She cupped his face in her hands and said, "We did this together." And he nodded and pressed his forehead briefly to hers, and the kitchen was warm around them, and outside the garden was sleeping under its winter mulch waiting for spring, and the house that had been a warehouse for a man's grief was full and warm and alive. The summer of 1884 passed in a state of anticipatory fullness. The garden was at its best, yet 3 years of Nora's management had built the soil into something genuinely remarkable, and the harvest that summer was the finest the property had ever produced. She gardened until late in the season, with modifications as her pregnancy advanced, and Elias was attentive in the way he did everything practically and completely, ensuring she did not lift what should not be lifted, checking the distance between the house and the garden with a spatial awareness that she found both touching and, on occasion, gently amusing. "Elias," she said one August morning, catching him measuring the distance from the porch to the garden gate with an expression of focused calculation, "I'm not made of glass." "I did not say you were," he said. "What are you calculating?" "The gate latch," he said. "It takes 2 hands. I'm going to change it to a single-hand operation so you can open it while carrying things." She looked at him. That is actually very practical." "Yes," he said, and went to get his tools. She stood on the porch and watched him go and loved him with the full, settled completeness that had been building since June of the previous year. The love that is not the frantic new love of the first months, but the deep, bone-certain love that has lived through difficulty and through the careful work of becoming real. In late September of 1884, in the bedroom of the Crane Ranch house, with the doctor brought out from Dusk Creek and Domingo pacing the yard with more anxiety than he had shown about anything in his 55 years, Nora gave birth to a boy. He was a solid, clear-lunged infant who announced himself to the ranch with a sound that carried across the yard and caused Domingo to stop pacing and stand very still for a moment, and then sit down heavily on the porch step and cover his eyes with his hand. Elias came out of the house 15 minutes later. His face was the face of a man who has had something enormous happen to him that he has no prior experience with which to process it. He sat down beside Domingo on the porch step and said nothing for a moment. Domingo did not ask, he waited. "He is very small," Elias said. "I was not prepared for how small." Domingo nodded. She says he has my eyes." "But his nose is entirely hers." Domingo nodded again. "I held him," Elias said, and his voice was not entirely steady. "I held him and he stopped crying. He just looked at me." Domingo, who was a man of considerable composure, was finding the current moment somewhat challenging to composure. He pressed his lips together and looked at the yard and said, in a voice that was deliberately level, "What is his name?" Elias was quiet for a moment. He had told Nora what he was thinking, and she had said yes without hesitation. "James," he said. "James Domingo Crane." A long pause. "You should go back inside," Domingo said after a moment in a voice that was not quite as level as it had been. "Your wife and your son are waiting." Elias stood. He looked at Domingo's turned face and understood what the man was feeling, because he was feeling it himself, the enormous and simple gratitude of a person who has been given something they did not deserve and know it and are determined not to waste it. "Thank you," Elias said. It meant what he had said to Nora in February of the previous year. All of it, the letter, the 6 years of patience with him, the unwavering loyalty that had made this moment possible, all of it. Domingo waved him off with one hand, not trusting his voice entirely. Elias went back inside. James Domingo Crane grew in the manner of children of good stock and good care, steadily, enthusiastically, and with a pronounced tendency toward the particular kind of determination that comes of having 2 very strong-minded parents. He had Elias's coloring and Nora's capacity for absolute focus when something interested him, and from a very early age, he showed an attachment to the garden that delighted his mother and made Elias privately suspect that some traits simply come through the soil. The ranch changed again with the child in it. The bunkhouse, which had maintained for years a kind of respectful professional distance from the main house, found itself drawn in by the gravity of a baby with opinions, and Pete Garland, in particular, developed a fondness for the boy that expressed itself in the construction of small wooden toys of increasing ambition and complexity. Even Hector the Hound, who was old now and moved with the dignified slowness of an elder, adopted a position of honorary guardian that he maintained with great seriousness. Dusk Creek, which had discussed Elias Crane for years in terms ranging from awe to wariness, recalibrated its view with the thoroughness that small communities apply to such revisions. The man who had been the coldest in the territory was seen, regularly, walking through the Saturday market in town with his wife and their son, and if he was not exactly effusive in his public warmth, he was unquestionably present in a way he had never been before: engaged, attentive, sometimes heard to laugh at something Nora said, which was regarded by witnesses as a phenomenon on the order of a weather event. Sheriff Whitmore ran into him at the dry goods store one Saturday in the spring of 1885 and shook his hand and said, with the directness of a man who has been waiting several years to say something, "It's good to see you, Elias. It's good to see you looking like yourself." Elias looked at him. "You did not know me well enough to know what I look like when I'm myself." Whitmore grinned. "I'm going by the evidence of the present." Elias considered that. "Fair," he said, and actually returned the grin with something that in anyone else would have been described as a full smile, which in Elias Crane's case was a significant occurrence, and which Whitmore described to his deputy later with the enthusiasm of a man reporting something historically noteworthy. 2 years after James was born, Nora told Elias at the kitchen table again at breakfast, again with the morning light coming in gold, and long across the room, that there would be a second child. He was better prepared this time for the feeling, but not entirely prepared, because it turns out that particular feeling does not become less enormous with repetition. He looked at her across the table, and she was watching him with that warm and steady look, and he said, "How are you feeling?" "Well," she said, "very well. A bit tired in the mornings, but that will pass." "I will take James in the mornings," he said immediately. "So you can sleep," she smiled at him. "You will take him to the stable to look at horses before dawn and call it sleeping in. He likes the horses." "He does," she agreed. "He absolutely does. That is not what I said." He looked at her with the expression that had been developing for 3 years, the one that was warm and direct and slightly lit from inside, that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the face that Dusk Creek had spent 6 years describing as suitable for wilting sunflowers. He said, "I will adjust the schedule." "I know you will," she said, with complete confidence, and reached across the table to pour him more coffee in the easy, ordinary, intimate way of a woman who knows exactly who she is pouring it for and is entirely certain of her place beside him. The second child arrived in the fall of 1886. This time Domingo waited in the kitchen rather than the yard, because the weather was cold and because he acknowledged privately, 3 years older and had less patience for cold porches than he had previously. He sat at Nora's kitchen table with his coffee and the sound of James playing with his wooden horse on the floor beside him, and he waited. And when the sound of new life came through the house walls, he looked at James and said, "You have a sibling." James looked up from the floor, gave this information the serious consideration of a 2-year-old, and said, "Horse." "No," Domingo said. "Better." The baby was a girl. They named her Clara, and if the choosing of that name involved a conversation between Elias and Nora that took place quietly and privately, and with the particular gravity of something long considered, the naming itself was right in a way that they both felt in their bones, a honoring and a continuation, not a haunting. Clara Crane arrived in the world with her mother's dark eyes and what appeared to be her father's opinion of unnecessary noise, which was to say, she was a serious and observant infant who watched the world around her with a focused attention that Domingo said reminded him of someone he knew, and would not specify further, which made Nora laugh. The ranch in the autumn of 1886 was a thing of considerable beauty and considerable noise, with James at 2.5 providing locomotion-based chaos and the new baby providing the counterpoint of demanding stillness, and Nora navigating both with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything, and Elias working the ranch during the day with the focused efficiency that had always characterized him, but returning each evening not to the empty house of a man with nowhere to go, but to the full and noisy and warm house of a man who is expected and wanted. He came home one November evening from a long day at the south pasture, cold and tired and slightly muddy, and he came in through the back door to find James asleep on the kitchen settle, which was where he fell asleep when he had resisted going to his bed, and lost the battle to tiredness, and Nora at the kitchen table nursing Clara in the lamplight with the astronomy book open on the table in front of her, reading with the one-handed ease of a woman who has adapted. She looked up when he came in, and the light was warm and yellow, and the kitchen smelled of dinner still holding warm on the stove, and her face when she looked at him had the expression she had developed for his returns, not dramatic, not performative, just a specific quality of warmth and welcome that was directed entirely at him, and was the most purely good thing he had ever been the recipient of in his life. He sat down across from her and looked at his sleeping son on the settle and his daughter in his wife's arms and his wife's face in the lamplight, and he understood, with the clean and complete clarity that has nothing to do with words, what had been waiting for him on the other side of 6 years of grief and stone. "You are home late," she said softly, so as not to wake James. "South fence," he said, equally quiet. "All done now." "Good," she said. "Dinner is on the stove." "I know," he said. "Could smell it from the yard." She smiled, looking back at her book for a moment, and he sat in the warm kitchen watching his family and feeling the particular enormous quiet of a man who has found his way back from somewhere very dark and knows it, and does not take a single day of the light for granted. The years that followed built on each other the way good things do not in dramatic eruptions, but in the steady accumulation of ordinary days that are themselves the extraordinary things. The garden continued to grow and improve under Nora's devoted management, and by 1888 it had become something of a landmark. On its own visitors to the ranch remarked on it, and she had begun giving her seeds and her knowledge to any neighbor or family in the territory who asked, which they increasingly did. She was not interested in credit for it. She was interested in things growing. James, at 4, learned to ride a small pony with the focused determination of a child who has decided to be excellent at something and is not yet acquainted with the possibility of failure. Elias spent Saturday mornings in the corral with him, patient in a way that no one who had known him in his cold years would have recognized, crouching down to adjust a boot in the stirrup, talking the boy through sitting balance with the methodical clarity of someone who has given real thought to how to explain a physical thing to a child. Nora watched them from the fence sometimes, these two, the broad, serious man and the small, serious boy who looked at the world with the same gray riverstone eyes, and she felt the full, quiet weight of the life they had built, and she was grateful for every piece of it, including the difficult pieces, because the difficult pieces had been where everything real had been constructed. Domingo, at 57, was beginning to slow slightly in the way that strong men slow, when the years finally accumulate past even their considerable resistance. Elias noticed and adjusted, took more of the heavy work himself, shifted Domingo's responsibilities toward oversight and planning rather than physical labor, did it all in a way that preserved the man's dignity completely. Nora, who noticed everything, made sure Domingo's Thursday dinners at the house were supplemented by a packed lunch on Fridays and sometimes Mondays, which Domingo accepted with the grace of someone who understands when they are loved and chooses not to be embarrassed by it. In 1888, Nora became pregnant a third time, and this time the pregnancy was harder in its middle months than the previous two had been. There were weeks in the summer when she was tired in a way that was different from ordinary tiredness, and Elias, whose composure was by this point deeper and more confident than it had ever been in the old cold days, but who was also more capable of feeling fear than he had allowed himself to be in those days, managed his fear by being entirely present and entirely useful cooking dinners when she could not, managing the children's routines, sitting beside her in the evenings reading aloud when she was too tired to read herself. The third child, born in late 1888, was healthy and considerable, a boy they named Thomas, who arrived with a voice like a declaration and a grip that caused Elias to remark, with entirely sincere astonishment, that the boy was the strongest person he had ever shaken hands with, which made Nora laugh from her pillow with the full, unguarded laugh that was still, after 6 years of marriage, exactly the same as it had been on the morning with Hector and the biscuits, warm and helpless and completely genuine. Elias sat beside her bed with Thomas in his arms and James asleep down the hall and Clara in Domingo's care in the kitchen, and he looked at his wife and thought about a cold morning in April of 1882, when Domingo had placed a folded letter on the kitchen table, and he had almost thrown his coffee cup. "Are you all right?" he asked her, because she was tired and the birth had been harder than the others. "Yes," she said, "very well, just I need to sleep." "Sleep," he said. "Don't go." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. He sat in the chair beside her bed with his youngest son in his arms, and she fell asleep to the sound of him speaking quietly to the baby, not words. Exactly. Just the low, steady murmur of a man talking to someone very new about nothing in particular and everything that matters, and the lamp burned low, and the ranch was quiet around them, and the New Mexico sky outside the window was enormous and full of its patient stars. By 1890, the Crane Ranch was a prosperous and well-regarded operation, known through the territory not only for the quality of its cattle, but for the character of its people. Elias was not suddenly social. He was still a man who found his peace in work and in the close company of the people he loved rather than in crowds or performance. But he was known as fair and trustworthy, and when his word was given it was kept, and he was no longer the cold man of the territory's stories. The stories had changed, as stories do when the subject of them changes. Now people said he was the steadiest man in the region, the one you went to when you needed something done correctly and kept confidential, the one whose ranch was the warmest house in the valley and whose wife's garden produced enough to share with half the county. Domingo, at 61, retired from foreman duties with a ceremony that consisted of Nora making his favorite meal, and the children performing a somewhat chaotic rendition of a song they had been working on for 2 weeks, and Elias presenting him with a deed to a small house on the edge of the property that he had built quietly over the winter. Domingo looked at the deed and then at Elias and said nothing for a very long time, which was unlike him, and then he said, "You did not have to." "Yes, I did," Elias said. "You are a very aggravating person," Domingo said, which was the highest compliment he knew how to give, and embraced the man he had worked beside for 14 years and planted a seed in and watched grow back into himself. The house on the edge of the property was not far, a 5-minute walk from the main house, which suited everyone. Domingo came to Thursday dinner for as long as he was able, and for years after the children were used to finding him on the porch in the morning, or at the fence watching the horses, and he was as much a part of the household as the cottonwood trees and the garden and the particular smell of the kitchen on bread-baking mornings. James grew into a young man who had his father's discipline and his mother's warmth, and was, by 14, already thinking about the ranch the way someone thinks about a future. Clara grew into someone who read everything she could find and had strong opinions about all of it, which her parents found both challenging and deeply gratifying. Thomas, at 4, was already Hector's designated best friend and had a relationship with the ranch's dogs in general that suggested a vocation. The spring of 1891 came in warm and early, and the garden was the best it had ever been. 9 years of Nora's management had built something genuinely extraordinary, the soil deep and productive, the beds laid out with a logic and beauty that the new almanac writer who came through the territory in March asked to describe in print, which Nora agreed to on the condition that she could check the article for accuracy, which she did, firmly and with good humor. Elias found her in the garden on a Saturday morning in April, a morning that had the quality of mornings in the year before, warm and clear and full of possibility, the light on the cottonwoods doing its amber and gold, and he stood at the gate watching her work for a moment before she heard him. She straightened and turned, and she was 43 now, and her hair was different, and the years were in her face, but she was more herself than she had ever been. The full, settled depth of a woman who has spent years building something real and knows its value. She looked at him with a warm, specific look. He came through the gate and stood beside her in the spring morning, and she put her arm through his as naturally as breathing, and they stood together looking at what 9 years had made of the barren ground, the green and ordered abundance of it, the climbing things and the rooted things and the everything in its place. "Do you remember," he said, "when I told you you could do with the garden as you saw fit?" "I remember," she said. "I had no idea," he said. He looked at the garden and then at her. "I had no idea what that meant when I said it." She leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment and said, "No, but you said it." He put his arm around her shoulders, and they stood in the spring garden in the New Mexico morning, and the ranch was alive around them with its familiar sounds. And somewhere inside the house, Thomas was shouting something at Clara about his dog, and Clara was responding with the patience of someone 8 years older who has had considerable practice. And James's voice came from the stable, talking to the horses the way his mother talked to plants, which Elias had pointed out once, and Nora had found deeply satisfying. He tightened his arm around her and she looked up at him, and his face was the face of a man who is entirely at home in his life, which was a thing that had taken a great deal of making and a great deal of help to arrive at, and which he did not, for a single day, take for granted. He said, "I love you." He said it easily, in the way he had learned to say things that were true, not dramatically, not with performance, but with the full and unhesitating weight of something he was entirely certain of. She said, "I know," with the warmth she kept specifically for him, and then, because she was who she was and he loved her for it, "I love you too. Have since June of 1882, as I believe I mentioned." "You did mention it," he said. "I mention it again for the record," she said. He laughed the real laugh, the one that had been gone for years and had come back and had only gotten fuller and easier with time, and she laughed too. And the garden caught the sound of it, and the house caught the sound of it, and the warm April morning held it, and the Crane Ranch, which had been a cold and magnificent silence for 6 years, was filled with the sound of two people who had found their way to each other through difficulty and patience, and the particular grace of a woman who had walked into a closed-up house and simply refused to let it stay closed. The morning went on. The garden grew. The children argued and laughed. The horses moved in the stable. The cottonwoods caught the light. And Elias Crane, who had been known as the coldest man in the territory, stood in his wife's garden with his arms around her in the spring morning, warm down to the bone.